It should come as no shock that many people who are either Jurassic franchise fans or dinosaur fans in general collect figures of their favorite animals. Some collect statues, but others, like myself, prefer and collect figures with articulation. Each of us collects for a different reason, be it photography, stop motion like myself, or just to have them around because they're cool. Dinosaur fans overall have a pretty good selection of figures they can buy, but when it comes to Jurassic franchise releases, Mattel kind of holds them in a chokehold as far as options go. The only official figures that are properly articulated are those released in the Hammond Collection line. And while customizers make some pretty badass figures, they're just not as affordable as Mattel releases. This isn't me throwing shade towards any customizers, because I genuinely love the work they do. Rather, this is me going after Mattel for failing collectors in multiple regards despite years after years of criticism and videos pointing out how they can improve. While their figures may be affordable, they simply aren't worth the asking price most of the time and suffer from some pretty glaring issues that are honestly embarrassing. For the sake of this video, I'm going to focus on purely dinosaurs. The human releases have their own set of issues that can be better covered by somebody else. The most embarrassing of their failures is the Hammond Collection line, and that is the first line I'll be focusing on as it's portrayed as a premium line when in reality it's far from such. The initial two Hammond Collection releases were the Baryonyx and the Parasaurolophus, and the promotional photos made them look great, but the figures were honestly pretty disappointing when I got them in hand. The Baryonyx is far from accurate to its Fallen Kingdom portrayal, and the Parasaurolophus looks like it got stung by a bee. The choice of engineering for the Para's jaw articulation also makes it look quite off, and it's hard to actually make it look good. The articulation for herbivore jaws should be more like the Beast of the Mesozoic figures, which in my opinion are herbivores done right. The sculpt of the cheeks is also far too pronounced, and it makes it look goofy compared to the actual animal in the franchise. As far as paint applications went, the main body was fine for what was offered. The tail, however, had barely any paint, much like mainline releases where the paint suddenly ends after a certain point. And, much like many mainline figures, they didn't bother to paint the nails on its forelimbs and were kind of lazy as far as color gradients went. The forelimb articulation is also quite limited and is held back by the sculpt for the forelimbs. The Baryonyx has many issues, most prominently in the sculpting department. The skull shape was inaccurate to the Fallen Kingdom version, which is already a pretty basic design to begin with, and the teeth were far too large, far too close together, and way too rounded. The feet are also significantly too large. General proportions of the design, barring the oversized feet, honestly aren't too far off, but the general accuracy is a far cry from what it's supposed to be. The claws on its hands are also really dulled down. The claws on its feet are sharper, which is both funny and sad. The paint application was also a miss in pretty much every regard, missing both the correct colors and shades as well as lacking any proper gradients. The underbelly paint also suffers from a persisting issue with Mattel releases, where it abruptly ends and the overall paint just feels really cheap and quite lazy. Many buyers of the Baryonyx also reported loose joints and chips in the sculpt throughout its body. Both issues are unfortunately the very same ones I experienced with my copy. The state of the Baryonyx was quite sad, especially when mainline sculpts somehow managed to be better than what was showcased as a premium figure. They fumbled the ball there. That being said, many of us were hopeful that future releases would improve after the initial two. Then we got surprised by the Triceratops and Velociraptors, which are arguably some of the worst releases in the entirety of both the Hammond Collection and the mainline.
Are you serious?
The Triceratops was actually a pathetic release. I cannot in good consciousness give it any praise. The figure lacks jaw articulation, which is a letdown, and the articulation it does have barely differentiates it from a mainline release. I'd go as far as to say it is a glorified mainline release, with how minimal its articulation is. The paint somehow manages to be worse than the Baryonyx and the Parasaurolophus, and looks more like something I'd expect from dollar store toys or little figurines within Happy Meals. The sculpt just also looks rough, and it feels lacking in details in certain areas such as the horns, and once again, mainline sculpt somehow managed to be better when it comes to details. There was no saving this release. The Velociraptors, as with all small Hammond Collection theropods, were disappointments, and for all intents and purposes I'll be including both every raptor and the Dilophosaurus in this section. The proportions of these figures are hilariously bad and very ugly, nowhere close to the designs of the animals are supposed to be. The feet on the Velociraptors are grossly oversized, and the paint gradients were horrible, especially when it comes to the Jurassic Park 3 Velociraptor releases.
Oh, hell no!
The Dilophosaurus manages to look somewhat like the iconic design, but fails in the exact same regards that plague the raptors: bad paint, ugly proportions, and bad engineering and details. The jaws also just look horrible, and the teeth look like toothbrushes on most releases. Newer iterations of the Velociraptors also have glass eyes, which are notoriously hard to notice on a lot of releases due to how they're engineered. The Acroraptor has ugly proportions, and much like the Velociraptors, it has a pretty ugly and inaccurate sculpt as well. The teeth aren't as close together as prior raptor releases, but they still somehow manage to look bad. They downsized the feet, but that's not enough to make it worth buying. The Pyroraptor is the closest to being accurate of all the raptors, but suffers from an incredibly cheap and poorly done paint job, alongside badly sculpted feathers for the wings and tail. What I can give the Pyroraptor credit for is that its jaw articulation is better designed than literally every other small theropod release. What happened to this being a premium line? The baby Stegosaurus looks more like a Disney character than the actual one in the Lost World, and the baby Triceratops just looks really ugly. I'm not going to go into depth with them, because the issues they have already been mentioned at some point. I mean, hey, it has mouth articulation, I guess? The juvenile Tyrannosaurus release was also really disappointing. In the promotional photos, Junior had pretty good paint application, but the paint was significantly worse for the final release. The sculpt was also off, though not super unfixable if they had just properly looked into the designs they were sculpting. It could have been a decent figure if not for the paint, barring its sculpt inaccuracies aside. Ceratosaurus was honestly one of my favorite looking releases, but the sculpt isn't accurate. That being said, I do prefer the figure's design, but they should have went with the accurate one. The paint isn't terrible, but the teeth aren't sharp enough, and the paint also just isn't super accurate and is lacking a few details. Metriacanthosaurus was a fine release, but I wish they had went with the Jurassic World Evolution color scheme, which is a lot better. Irritator was unironically good for being a nothing burger release with no weight as far as canon material went. It's actually better than the Baryonyx, which is funny, but also sad that an obscure species gets more effort while the one that actually has a movie appearance gets shafted. Barring its paint, Concavenator was also a pretty decent release, but the teeth were way too rounded and dull. It of course has its issues, and it isn't entirely accurate to the statue of it that appears in Fallen Kingdom either. This is a common trend amongst Mattel figures where they have the potential to be good but always end up missing the mark, which in turn shafts the collectors that are relying on them to push out quality content. The quality issues that I've had are quite embarrassing. For instance, my Ceratosaurus is missing a piece of its jaw, which reveals the screw that would otherwise be hidden on a normal copy. This shouldn't be happening. The issues tend to get worse when you look at the larger carnivore releases. The Carnotaurus actually has a good sculpt, and though the underbelly paint abruptly ends before the tail, I'd go as far as to say it's the best of the Hammond releases. Proportions are good, overall quality is decent, and the feet aren't crazy oversized. Its main issue is articulation, but it manages to actually be decently accurate for what it is. Unfortunately, their redemption arc didn't continue because the Allosaurus ended up being a flop in retrospect. The figure itself looks nice, don't get me wrong, but when you compare its proportions and sculpt to the Fallen Kingdom and battle at Big Rock Allo, it's not really accurate. So close, yet so far. It also had embarrassing quality issues such as missing paint entirely on some sides, and for some reason Mattel decided to bring back the clown feet, when the carnal feet honestly would have worked fine. The glass eye is also poorly implemented and hard to notice on some copies, a trend amongst these releases. The megatheropods? They have it bad too. The Tyrannosaurus release is inaccurate to both Jurassic Park and Jurassic World models, and its proportions are quite ugly. The joints were also more prone to becoming loose than future releases, and it looks like it's wearing clown shoes. The glass eye looks strange due to the materials used as well, and some copies had weird splotches of paint from factory mistakes. My copy has these splotches, but I haven't bothered with getting another because it's ultimately not worth the price or time. The Giganosaurus also had an embarrassing release. Some copies had small holes throughout them, others had 2 right or 2 left arms, and the snout is too wide compared to the actual animal in the movie. Its arms are also significantly oversized compared to its Jurassic World Dominion counterpart. From a side view, the figure does look nice, and it's better than the fumble that was mainline Giga, but it's still far from truly being a premium figure. Somehow, some of these copies also made it out of factory without having their head shells glued in place. How do I know? Because that's how my copy arrived. And after 6 months, I still haven't managed to get the top head shell to properly stay on. This is the second time this figure's head shell has popped off for me, despite attempts to lock it in place. I paid $40 for this. This is kind of ridiculous.
Mods, crush the skull, thank you.
The Therizinosaurus has an inaccurate head sculpt, and it lacks the characteristic cataracts that the Dominion Theory had in both eyes. The figure looks nice as its own thing, but it just fails to make the mark once again. The articulation choices are also strange, especially for the claws and the hands in general. The Hammond Collection Ankylosaurus is just the Jurassic World one, repainted as the Jurassic Park 3 one. The mainline quality has dropped since the 2018 Fallen Kingdom releases. The figures tend to suffer from either bad paint, bad sculpt, or bad gimmicks. Some figures are good. Some suffer from all these issues. I'm not sure why the quality is tanked across the board. I don't collect mainline, so it doesn't really affect me, but I can see where things have, and are, falling off. The Hammond Collection has ultimately been a big fail so far. Out of all the releases in this line, maybe 3 are actually good enough to justify buying. But every other release just feels like a scam to me, and they're ultimately not worth it. These figures are pushed as faithful and premium representations of their movie counterparts, but the reality is that they're far from faithful and far from premium figures. And despite being put on a pedestal by many, people suffer from many quality issues, many of which can be quite severe and should not be happening. Many collectors end up being forced to buy the Mattel releases because there's really no other company that specializes in affordable and articulated Jurassic figures. Nanmu releases are more expensive, and once all pre-orders are taken up, that's pretty much every figure spoken for. And the custom-made figures from customizers can be up to $250 in price. Even more depending on who is making them and how large they are and what materials are used in the process of making them. Many people defend Mattel and the Hammond Collection because of the figures they offer, but ultimately as collectors we've been robbed of what could have been with many releases. The figures released by Mattel could have been so much better if they had just put a little bit more effort into them, if they'd cared just a little bit more about feedback, especially from larger content creators such as Marco makes. The standard for quality has been set by Mattel, further encouraged by the community becoming complacent with the quality continuing to drop lower and lower. I'd be lying if I said there wasn't any aspects I liked with any figures, because there are some things I was okay with, but I cannot in good faith defend the company nor the line when it continues to fumble in the way it has, failing to deliver its promises and failing to live up to what it's been promoted to be. Jurassic collectors are already a niche within a niche when it comes to being dinosaur and figure collecting fans. For Mattel to essentially hold a monopoly on the franchise and the figures produced is really unfortunate for collectors, when they're not putting their all into giving us the best figures possible. We deserve better, so much better than what we're being offered. But unfortunately, the quality may only continue to get worse if the community continues to be complacent. As for me, I've stopped collecting anything from Mattel. They do make some figures that look cool, but they're just not worth the price 90% of the time. On top of that, I just really do not want to support a company that continues to get cheap with its releases, especially the ones that are supposed to be premium. If you have any thoughts or opinions on the matter, feel free to comment down below, but that's all for this video. I'll see you in the next one.